Section G, the farmer's frontier. So during the Civil War, when the Republicans were running things in Congress, they passed in 1862 the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act really shows a shift in how the government is approaching this land out west. Before they were selling the land to make money, and now we see this shift of they're kind of giving away the land at just a nominal price to encourage settlers to go west. So if you were a settler, you would get a homestead of 160 acres at the bargain value of $30 an acre. However, you had to promise to improve the land. That usually meant farm the land, build a house, that sort of thing. So when the first 40 years of this Homestead Act, we see about 500,000 families really taking advantage of the act. There was a downside, however, because in the Great Plains region, the region kind of west of the Missouri River, so like Nebraska, the Dakotas, Oklahoma, it was too dry there. So really 160 acres wasn't enough to live off of. So about 2/3 of the farmers who actually took advantage of the Homestead Act actually ended up leaving farming altogether. And you know, there was some fraud connected with this as well. It wouldn't be the Gilded Age if we didn't have some corruption. So the fraud happened when corporations or companies would kind of hire people to be kind of dummy homesteaders. So they would use the name of a person, and they would go out and they would build homes that would be, for example, 12 by 14 buildings. What they failed to mention were the fact that these buildings weren't 12 feet by 14 feet. These buildings were 12 inches by 14 inches. So we see some people kind of taking advantage of this. It's more or less corporations are buying up this land cheap. Yes. Anyway, well, yeah, like I said, 500,000 families took advantage of this, but really at this time we see about 5 times more people actually buying the land from states or from railroads. And as we mentioned kind of before, the railroads were recruiting people from Europe even to come to America and buy their land grant land. A lot of railroads folks had agents, thousands of agents across Europe, handing out leaflets in many languages, really recruiting immigrants to come and buy this land in the West. And something to note is, talking about the land here, at first people thought that the Great Plains were too dry to farm. I mean, they looked at the plains, there weren't any trees, and plus the soil or the sod was so compact because millions and millions of buffalo had, trampled them for millions and millions of years. So at first people were like, well, the Great Plains, it's not going to be a good place to farm. But people started attempting it and they found out, hey, this can work. It takes 4 oxen, but you can plow, you can bust through that sod. And people got around not needing trees. Okay, so instead of building log cabins, they would build sod houses, or houses kind of out of this dense mud. Also, instead of burning logs in the fireplace, they would burn corn cobs. So people were making adjustments to live out in the West. Something to note here is there's this kind of magic line. It's called the 100th meridian, meridian meaning line of longitude, and this is a line that extends north through kind of central Canada, central Texas into Canada. And really this line was really discovered by or put forth by a guy, a geologist I should say, named John Powell. And he had explored Colorado, the Grand Canyon, and really what he made note of was the fact that the land kind of east of this 100th meridian was enough rainfall to farm, but the land west of the 100th meridian was too dry to farm. So he made that known, but farmers don't always follow the wisdom of geologists. And a lot of farmers headed west of that 100th meridian, that's what the word is, and they lost out. People were going into, Texas, people were going into Montana, Kansas, East Colorado, and they really, they tried their darndest, but they just couldn't make a living because it was too dry west of the 100th meridian. Yay. Anyway, this, as the saying went back in the day, there's no God west of Salina, Kansas, in the west, too hard to farm. Wonderful. But, people adapt, and people tried to find new techniques, new ways to become successful even in this dry land. They tried new methods of, it's called dry farming, which is just a constant cultivation of the topsoil, and that'll actually lead us into the dirty 30s, in the 1930s, when we see the Dust Bowls picking up. It's kind of because of these dry farming techniques. Also, they imported new strands of kind of tougher wheat from Russia that could hold up to drought, hold up to cold a bit better. Since there wasn't any wood to build fences, we see the invention of the barbed wire fence, and that is created by Joseph Glidden in 1874. So instead of wooden fences to keep in cattle or whatnot, people used barbed wire. And also, the federal government really funded heavily the irrigation of the West. The federal government poured in a lot of money. We see dams being built on the Missouri River, a dam being built on the Columbia River, and we see kind of the desert in bloom. This irrigation helps farmers survive in the West. And so really, more than anything else, more than miners, more than railroad workers, more than even cowboys, it's really the hydraulic engineers that shape the West. Those who build these irrigation systems are really the ones who won the West for America, because without them, the land would be worthless. All right, section H, the Far West comes of age. All right, so this is kind of talking about different states that formed during this time. Between 1870 to 1890, we see the surge of migration to the West, and a lot of new Western states are developing. We see Colorado become a state in 1876. Their population really boomed when, they discovered gold in the Rockies. The Pikes Peakers came in to mine. 1889 through 1890, that couple years there, we see 6 new states forming, both North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming. And 1896, we see Utah finally becoming a state. Of course, Utah probably had the most people of anyone because of the Mormons, but they had refused to abide by the federal rule of not allowing polygamy. So they didn't actually get to become a state until they made a state law forbidding polygamy. Praise the Lord. All right. And then also we see Oklahoma. Oklahoma is kind of a special case because originally the state of Oklahoma was an Indian territory. We mentioned that there was kind of 2 major territories for Indians. One in the south being, modern day Oklahoma, just known as the Indian Territory. So the federal government decided to open up this Oklahoma territory to settlers, and they promised to open it up at noon on April 22nd, 1889. So what we see is people are actually on the border, of Oklahoma, waiting for the bugle to sound at noon, and then about 10,000 people at noon flooded in to Oklahoma, hoping to stake a claim of the best sort of territory. And, of course, there were some cheaters. What these were called Sooners, people who went into the territory too soon, right, before it was legal to do so. So they go in the territory, kind of find the best claim they could, and try to, hide out until it was officially open. And so we have federal troops kind of combing up and down Oklahoma, trying to kick out these Sooners so it would be fair for everyone. So yeah, Oklahoma, known as the Sooner State, due to this, the opening of the border, people were sneaking in too soon. Yes. All right, the fading frontier, section I. So in 1890, the official census officially said that there was no discernible frontier line anymore. Before, there was definitely that frontier line, that line kind of going through northern Texas, through central Texas, north into Canada. That was the frontier, but by 1890, the frontier line was fuzzing. It was fuzzy, it was fading, it was disappearing. People were, just flooding in. And the West filled up really quickly, okay? People had assumed it might take maybe 500 years to fill in all of this land, but it happened, almost overnight in the course of history. And we see at this time a very influential essays, I should say. And these were written by Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner, he wrote a series of essays called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. He published it in 1893. And what Turner's really putting forth here is this kind of safety valve theory. His idea was this, that America's democracy had worked out so well because anytime there was an economic depression, instead of unemployed workers just kind of gathering in cities, kind of becoming rebellious, that sort of thing, instead, when people became unemployed, they always had that safety valve. They always had the option of heading west, and making their fortune there. Okay, well, the thing was, this is maybe an exaggerated claim, because not everyone out east who was unemployed knew how to farm. So it's not like, oh, I just lost my job at the factory, let me just, go across the country and become a farmer. That didn't really happen very much. But the theory still held true to some extent. For example, we see, of course, the floods, just a flood of immigration at this time. And not every immigrant stayed in the city. A lot of those immigrants actually headed out west. And that helped the cities from being crazily overpopulated. But really the safety valve at this time were the western cities themselves. So, miners who had lost their job, farmers who had gone bankrupt, they could really go and find employment in these western cities like San Francisco or Denver. Yeah. And then this section really just kind of ends with just talking about the idea that with the closing of the frontier, that means the frontier is kind of filled in. This is like the end of our westward expansion that had started with Columbus. We were in Europe and then we started to head west. And then we were in colonies and we started to head west towards the Appalachians. And then we went past the Appalachians and we went past the Mississippi River. And now we're from sea to shining sea. It's just the idea that this westward, progression that's been going on over time is finally coming to a close. Section J, the farm becomes a factory. All right, so before, and even today a little bit, farmers are really kind of jacks of all trade. I mean, they made their own clothes, they had their own vegetable garden, they grew their own food, they would barter with their neighbor for what they needed. But now crops are so lucrative, they can make so much money with crops like corn or wheat. They really become a one-hit wonder of sorts. They really start growing crops as a cash crop and then buying whatever else they need. We see at this time the mail order catalogs becoming popular. You get your catalog and you could send in, to Sears to get your socks or your winter coat, what have you. And the first really mail order catalog comes from Chicago, and the firm is called Aaron Montgomery Ward. All right, 1872, Aaron Montgomery Ward, first mail order catalog. All right, so yeah, we're seeing farms really becoming big business. We see a lot of times farms expanding in size during this time. And really what allows them to expand is this mechanization of agriculture, meaning new inventions, new tools, new machines that help agriculture become more efficient. The more efficient you are, the more land you can farm. A couple inventions, all of these are very expensive, of course. In the 1870s, we see the invention of the twine binder. What it was is it would both cut the grain and then it would wrap it into little bundles with twine. So that was a big invention. And then later on in the 1880s, we see the combine, which is a combination of both a reaper and a thresher. Okay, reaper means, cuts the corn stalk down. A thresher then would go and take like the kernels off the corn. So kind of 2 in 1. Cut down the corn and then take the kernels off of the cob. At least that's an example with corn. So the combine, huge invention. It had to be pulled by about 40 horses, but hey, it saved a lot of time, made it a lot more efficient. And the whole idea here is because of these new inventions, the mechanization of agriculture, America really becomes the breadbasket of the world and also, the butcher shop of the world. Hashtag, hogs. Yeah, hogs. And like I said, we see an expansion of farms. Specifically in the Dakotas, we have these huge wheat farms. They're called bonanza farms. And there would be up to 15,000 acres large. So machines, very expensive, but you could farm a lot more land. So we see a lot of the small farmers kind of being knocked out of business by these big farmers who are taking over. And almost kind of as a side note, just talking about California, because why not? California had always had kind of huge farms. Most California farms are usually about 3 times larger than farms elsewhere in the United States. And a lot of times what they'd be growing would be fruit, vegetables, and the laborers there would usually be ill-paid Mexicans or Chinese. All right. Next section, Section K. Section K, deflation dooms the debtors. All right, so the root of the problems of the farmers at this time were twofold. Okay, they kind of had 2 enemies. One was the general decrease in the price of their goods, and the other one, the second kind of root problem here, is deflation. So we'll look at both of those. So let's look at just the general decrease in the value of their goods. Prices going down. Here's something to keep in mind. When you're talking about farming, you're talking about a commodity like wheat or like corn. So it's not just the United States, but you're also in competition with wheat farmers, say, in Russia. So if the wheat farmers in Russia have a bumper crop, that means there's going to be a lot of wheat in the world market, and because there's such a high supply, that means the price per bushel of wheat will go down. On the flip side, however, say Russia has a drought, so Russia barely produces any wheat. That means the supply worldwide is going down, and with the decrease in supply, you get an increase in the price of wheat per bushel. So just something to keep in mind is it really was the farmers were at the mercy of the worldwide economy with regards to their crops. So that was kind of the first enemy, the fear that, they would have just a general decrease in the value of their crops. All right. The second issue farmers were dealing with was deflation of currency. And let me explain this through inflation, because we're used to inflation, not deflation. For example, like back in the day, if you wanted a can of pop, it was like 50 cents, okay? But over time, that can of Coke became 75 cents. Then that same can of Coke became $1. And now if you want to go get a bottle of pop or whatever, it's like $1.25 for the same thing, right? That means inflation. The price of a good is inflating. It's getting bigger. Like you inflate a balloon, it blows up, it gets bigger. Price of goods are getting bigger. All right. Flip side, deflation. This is what's happening at the time would be, for example, if that $1.25 bottle of pop is now only worth 50 cents. Deflation means the value of goods in general is going down. And this is bad for farmers. The title's called Deflation Dooms Debtors. Because here's the deal. Farmers were kind of in perpetual debt. They had to have loans for machinery, for land, that sort of thing. So farmers were in debt, and deflation hurts debtors. So an example your book gives. Just in this example of deflation. Okay, so say 1855, you take out a $1,000 loan. And in 1855, say, the price of a bushel of wheat was $1. So in effect, in 1855, if you borrow $1,000, that was kind of translated in the farmer's mind of saying, okay, I owe 1,000 bushels of wheat. However, remember Grover Cleveland? He had this whole thing called contraction when the value of $1 actually increased. Well, that led to deflation, meaning the price of a bushel of wheat went down. And the price of goods in general deflated or went down. So now, instead of a bushel of wheat being $1, like it was when you took out your loan, now that same bushel of wheat, due to deflation, is maybe only 50 cents. So now the farmer who had taken out the original loan of $1,000 doesn't owe 1,000 bushels of wheat. Now, since a bushel of wheat's not $1 but 50 cents, it's like they owe 2,000 bushels of wheat. So you can see deflation really harms the debtor. And then, the farmers, it didn't help that they kept producing more and more crops because the farmers were becoming in debt. They thought the only way to get out of debt was to produce more crops, so they would farm even more. And because everyone was producing more crops or farming more, that meant they were expanding the supply. And because they're expanding the supply, they are at the same time lowering the price once more of the goods. So it was kind of this circle of debt the farmers were just kind of stuck in. And, even the more they produced, the less their crops would be, and they were just kind of stuck, and they were not happy at all. So what would happen is a lot of these people would go bankrupt. They owned the land, but then they went bankrupt because they got into so much debt. So here's what would happen. They would keep on farming their same land, but now they had taken out a loan from a bank to pay for their farm, to pay off their debt, whatever it may be. So now, instead of owning their farms, they have a mortgage, which means they have a loan that they have to pay off. And the thing about mortgages are, there's always interest involved. So now farmers are paying interest on a mortgage. And there were some kind of loan sharks out there. So your interest rate on your mortgage would be anywhere between 8% to even 40%. So farmers who are in debt, lost their farms, went bankrupt, had to get a loan to buy their farms back, and these loans had huge amount of interest. So farmers were not very happy, which brings us to section L, unhappy farmers. Okay, so besides the mortgages and the interest and, just the hot mess, which was the economy, there are some other things that are making farmers sad. Okay, one thing was Mother Nature in general. There were, kind of just the insects were, taken over. For example, there would be mile-wide clouds of grasshoppers, and the grasshoppers would just kind of plow through any crops that were left. They'd just eat, all the corn, eat all the wheat, whatever have you. So the grasshoppers were making a mess. Also in the South specifically, there was a beetle called the Boll Weevil. The Boll Weevil ate cotton. So these beetles were eating all the cotton crops in the South, wreaking havoc, bugs. And also, with Mother Nature, there was erosion, which means, especially with dry farming, they were constantly plowing up the topsoil. But then a lot of times there would be floods. Praise the Lord. And the floods would then wipe away all of the topsoil. So you would have to now buy very expensive fertilizer to get your crops a-growing. Yes. And also Mother Nature, it was hot. And if you are a farmer in the middle of the summer in your little sod cabin, one, there's no trees for shade, and two, a lot of times you lived a really long distance from any water source. You had your well, but it's not like you could go cool off in your well. So actually there is this huge drought, especially starting in the summer of 1887, and it was so hot that we see a lot of people just giving up, walking away from farming, enough is enough. Yeah. Another thing that was making farmers unhappy was the fact that they had to pay a lot of taxes because, for a farmer, their assets or what they own are very visible. They had the barn, they had the animals, they had the land, everyone could see it. So when the tax assessors would come, they would have to pay a high rate of tax because they owned so much stuff. Well, on the East Coast, a lot of their money was tucked away into bonds or papers that could be easily hidden in a safe from the tax assessor. So really the farmers were getting, paying more taxes than a lot of people out east. Other things, of course, the tariff, the terrible tariff. Farmers hate the tariff because the tariff more or less makes goods very expensive for them while they don't get any of the benefit of it. The tariff really protects American-made goods, but it doesn't really protect crops because crops are, sold really internationally. So the tariff more or less just made farmers mad because it made manufactured goods more expensive. And also just in general, this was the age of the trust. Companies working together to eliminate competition. And without competition, they could, charge whatever they wanted for goods or services. So we see the farmers really being farmed at this time. Really kind of, anyway. So for example, like there would be a fertilizer trust, keeping the price of fertilizer high. There would be a barbed wire trust, keeping the price of barbed wire high. A lot of times too, railroad rates were super high for farmers. Also, if you wanted to store your grain at the elevator, they would charge you through the nose for that. And so just like every step along the way, they were just kind of being screwed over. They had to pay so much for everything. It was ridiculous, and they were sad. All right. And this kind of leads us to the end here. By 1890, still about half of the population of America were farmers. We saw a big growth in the city, but still about half of Americans were farmers. And they just haven't really organized yet. We saw kind of the labor unions, the laborers were starting to organize. We saw the barbed wire people starting to organize. We saw the oil people, the railroad people starting to organize. But it really was the farmers who were the last to really jump on board. And that was really because, they were kind of too stubborn. They were too independent. They were too individualistic. And plus we don't really see any leaders rise from the ranks to try to organize them. And that is enough for this video. We'll continue on and start to see some, attempts at organization of agriculture in the next video.